Today I am going to tell you the story of how during independence, immediately after independence, the Indian political leadership, especially the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, tried to define India's place in the world, in the community of nations, by proclaiming an ideologically inspired commitment to the freedom of the oppressed nations from colonial Western dominance, a commitment to the principle of neutralism, and suggesting non-alignment as a kind of an escape from a conflict-ridden world, particularly this announcement of non-alignment as a matter of principle, which was to guide India's foreign policy, which was shaping the perception of the Indian leadership about where India would figure in the post-Second World War situation, provided the nations and the countries a certain escape from the conflicts that were likely to be generated by the Cold War situation. In the course of the 1950s, there were many flashpoints of this Cold War between the United States as the leader of the Western Bloc and the Soviet Union leading the Eastern Bloc.
Sir, what was the impact of India's independence on the world politics?
Yeah, that is partly related to the question that we were trying to address by way of underlining the importance of neutralism as a matter of policy in Indian foreign policy. Some people say that neutralism was not an effective policy, or non-alignment was not an effective policy. It was a weapon of the weak. It was not realistic enough. Nehru was not realistic enough to realize that in the world that was emerging during the Cold War, it was very difficult to maintain a completely neutralist position. But the impact of India's independence can be measured more clearly from the way India had been able to command a good deal of respect from the newly independent nations. As an event, Indian independence actually set in motion a more elaborate process of decolonization, as a consequence of which these European nations were actually withdrawing from their colonies one after another. That was the time. I mean, if you look through the history of the 1950s and 60s, you see how the colonial powers were gradually winding up their colonies, granting independence to the oppressed nationalities in Africa and Asia. So the point that I was actually trying to emphasize is that in this kind of an altered situation after the Second World War, when conflicts between the two power blocs became very threatening, creating many flashpoints, non-alignment provided a kind of ray of hope for these oppressed, newly independent nationalities. What is also remarkable is that the language of Indian foreign policy, the way Indian leadership was trying to fashion their role of this world, divided into two power blocs, was an ideologically inspired statement in an age of decolonization. It is very difficult to understand the real import of such statements with the language of realpolitik. It was not realpolitik that Nehru and others were actually practicing. Their ideas were inspired by their long experience in the anti-colonial struggle, their familiarity with the history of the freedom movement, not just in India, but in other countries as well.
What impact did Pan-Asianism play on the Indian political leadership during the early 20th century?
Yeah, that remains an important question. Pan-Asianism, of course, gradually was emerging as a very important concern among the Indian leadership. But before we come to this, it is important to link Pan-Asianism with the anti-colonialist position. Much of this ideologically inspired vision about India's place in the world, as it came to be articulated by Nehru, had its roots in the anti-colonial struggle, persuading Indian leaders to adopt a position regarding what role India was likely to play in future, drawing the outlines of Indian foreign policy after independence. Ideology remains a very important factor because, as I said already, you will not be able to understand the import of the position that Nehru was taking in terms of real politics. The Congress itself, as you know, was divided about what to do during the Second World War. It was not as if that the Congress leadership did not have any protagonist of real politics. Subhash Bose, for example, who didn't have any significant ideological differences with Nehru before he left India, felt that the war was an opportune moment for the Congress to strike a fatal blow to the empire. So that was the language of real politics. I mean, it's not necessarily Machiavellian, but Bose was very anxious to come to terms with the reality of the situation and fashion his strategies accordingly. So he would undertake this secret journey to Berlin, tie up with Germany in order to start a kind of a military movement against the British with the help of the prisoners of war. And there were people in the Congress, who would not risk this kind of an open military confrontation, but who were inclined to believe that real politics must be given adequate consideration. But Nehru's position, to a large extent, was more ideologically inspired in this regard, because he was involved in the anti-fascist movement. He was engaged in various kinds of activity to combat the power of fascism. If we examine the foundation of Indian foreign policy in the anti-colonial struggle, Pan-Asianism begins to figure as a very important concern. And this Pan-Asianism requires to be studied against the backdrop of a series of statements which can be described as foreign policy statements of the early Congress leaders regarding what was the natural frontier of India. When Indian troops were deployed in China or in other parts of the colonial world, in Africa, in Asian countries, in Southeast Asia, the early Congress leadership actually expressed their resentment about the way Indian army men were deployed in imperial warfare elsewhere in the world. So it is not necessarily Pan-Asianism, but it is premised on the idea that with Asian neighbors, India was not likely to maintain a conflictual relationship of the kind that the British imperial rulers were actually resorting to. So British troops were moving into different areas, and the Congress leadership didn't endorse this. They criticized it on the ground that use of British army elsewhere in the world on the basis of taxes extracted from India imposed a heavy burden on the Indian people. So that is one aspect of the early foreign policy statements in which Pan-Asianism was implicit. But at the same time, there was a clear inclination to define the natural boundary. The natural boundary, of course, was constituted by the territorial boundary of British India. This frontier didn't survive the partition. But there was an attempt to define the natural boundary beyond which the early Congress leadership did not actually foresee or did not actually contemplate any armed intervention. So there was a willingness on the part of this early leadership to work out this idea of good neighborly relations with other Asian countries. So this is one dimension. But when we come to the question of Pan-Asianism, the kind of impact that Pan-Asianism was making on the Indian political leadership, we have to consider first a statement made by Tilak in 1919. Tilak was seeking to lead a delegation of Indian politicians in the Paris Peace Conference, but this opportunity was denied to him. But he wrote a kind of statement which he sent to Clemenceau, and he felt that Clemenceau would actually pass it over to Woodrow Wilson. One should consider the larger context in which Tilak was at that time functioning. He had returned to the Congress, and Woodrow Wilson, after the First World War, had come up with his famous 14 points, where national self-determination was a very important principle that he wished to espouse, and implicitly that was directed against the kind of domination that the colonial powers were exercising over large territories in the world. So it is in this context, in the early part of the 20th century, in the context of the First World War, Tilak, on behalf of the Indian National Congress, made the statement that India was committed to peace and India endorsed the idea of a League of Nations responsible for maintaining peace and stability in the world. But at the same time, Tilak was underlining the importance of India as an Asian power, arguing that in future, India was to emerge as one of the leading countries in Asia, a leader of Asia. Similar sentiments were expressed by intellectuals who were visualizing the possibility of the creation of a greater India. We are all not familiar with what is known as the Greater India idea. Suniti Chatterjee, the great linguist, when he was actually accompanying Rabindranath Tagore to Southeast Asian countries, described this region as the land of Indian islands, considering the kind of cultural impact that Indian civilization had made in the past. Tagore also had this kind of a feeling. It was not an aggressive sentiment. It was not actually couched in a language of domination, but at the same time, the emphasis was certainly on the very significant contribution that India had made to Southeast Asian culture. Add to this the claim that India was a land of cultural synthesis, where West Asia and the Southeast Asia met to create a kind of syncretic culture. At one level, India had its window open to West Asia. At another level, India had its connections with Southeast Asia. So the idea was that in the Asia that was going to emerge under the impact of nationalism, India was to figure as one of the greatest nations, the leader of Asia. So that was the kind of an underlying idea about what exactly would be India's position in Asian world, particularly when the Asian countries were going to achieve independence from colonial rule. So take, for example, the question of Khilafat. Now, the Congress position on the Khilafat was actually motivated by domestic political concerns. But at the same time, Khilafat, despite being a pan-Islamist notion, was an articulation of a Pan-Asian sentiment, which is an indictment of the imperial powers, like Britain, to destroy the existence of Khilafat. It was looked upon as a threat to the existence of the Asian power in Turkey. India began to figure in Indian imagination as a critical nation, a nation which can claim naturally the leadership of Asia for being the representative of a culture in which different streams of civilization in Asia had mingled to create a syncretic culture. Now, this sentiment, as I said, was reiterated on the eve of the Second World War. It's a kind of a running thread in the history of Indian Pan-Asianism. This was the time when Nehru became involved in international initiatives to combat fascism. He was very critical, along with many of his colleagues, about the appeasement policy of towards Germany that Britain was following. He was making a series of statements expressing India's commitment to international peace, but he ties it up with Western dominance, arguing that peace in the world could be guaranteed and secured only if Western dominance was brought to an end. So opposition to imperialism became tied with his anti-fascist position at one level and with Pan-Asianism at another level. There was a certain vision of rise of Asia in an age of decolonization. Nehru actually voiced this sentiment in the World Congress of Oppressed Nationalities in 1927, in which this kind of Pan-Asianist sentiment was articulated along with his anti-fascist positions, which became more pronounced during the 1930s. But in that conference in 1927, which was held at Brussels, he made this kind of a statement regarding the possibility of these Asian countries, which were now oppressed and dominated by the Western powers, emerging as the center of world politics in immediate future. Even before Nehru made such statements, there were already very strong initiatives from congressmen in that direction. In Gaya Congress, for example, in 1922, C.R. Das emphasized the need to convene a meeting of Asian Federation.
Sir, as we know that Jawaharlal Nehru was the main architect of Indian foreign politics after independence. So what I would like to know is, how did he set out the agenda for the future in the decades before independence?
Yeah, I mean, basically Nehru was actually continuing the legacy left behind by the early Congress leaders, by seniors like Tilak or like C.R. Das. But during the latter half of the 1920s, I was mentioning Nehru's very inspired statement in the Brussels Congress, the Congress of the Oppressed Nationalities. But Nehru persuaded the Indian National Congress to take a more assertive position. And this was also the time, 1928, when the Congress decided to set up its foreign department. The foreign department eventually started functioning from 1936 with Ram Manohar Lohia in charge, but all this is indicative of the way the initiatives began to be taken by the Congress. In 1930, the Congress resolved to convene a meeting of the Pan-Asian Federation. But this meeting couldn't be held because the civil disobedience movement in the meanwhile intervened. But on the eve of independence, during February-March 1947, when Nehru was the Prime Minister of the interim government, the Asian Relations Conference was held in Delhi, with representatives from 28 Asian countries present. These were not government representatives, but at the same time, it had the status of a certain kind of government delegation. The conference was hosted by the Indian Council of World Affairs that had been set up a couple of years earlier, in which Nehru insisted on the acceptance of the principle of equality between Asian nations. And he made once again that assertive statement that once Asia was free from Western dominance, a convenient situation would be created for the kind of cooperation that he was visualizing among Asian nations. So this is the foundation of the foreign policy statement that he was going to make soon as the Prime Minister of India, by way of espousing the principle of non-alignment. The directive principles also set out the agenda very clearly, that India was committed to international peace. And during the course of the 1950s, when North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created, when Southeast Asian Treaty Organization was created, the Warsaw Pact Treaty was concluded, power blocs like Soviet Union and the United States to create their own spheres of influence, Nehru espoused the cause of neutralism. Neutralism was often condemned as immoral by the Americans. Neutralism was criticized by many of Nehru's critics as a weak policy. At times also condemning it as opportunistic. But as I said already, that the language of real politics will not enable you to grasp the significance of this neutralism, which was ideologically inspired by a Pan-Asian vision, by a certain ideological commitment to maintenance of world peace. So there are problems in neutralism, but you can see from the subsequent history how he was able to command respect from some of the great world leaders like Nasser in Egypt or Tito in Yugoslavia. He has been able to rally behind the non-aligned conference. He held conferences at Bandung in Indonesia where some of these lofty principles were stated regarding cooperation among Asian powers, regarding a certain commitment on the part of these Asian countries to the principle of non-aggression. So one has to be a little more sympathetic towards the way the ideologically inspired statement about India's role in the world was actually visualized by Nehru.
Was this policy of non-alignment at all effective in securing national interest in the long run?
But that is one of the issues very frequently raised by Nehru's critics, that it was at best a weapon of the weak, and at worst it was actually depriving India of some of the facilities that India could have easily obtained by allying more directly with the United States. Certainly it led India into a series of diplomatic problems. But look at the Korean crisis. During the Korean crisis in 1950-51, India played a very important role, a role as a mediator. Initially, India condemned the manner in which the North Korean forces actually crossed the line, but then he did not endorse the American MacArthur's unilateral decision to march the United Nations Army into North Korea. So India had some difficulties in persuading United States to come round to the view that a certain kind of status quo needed to be maintained in Korea, but ultimately India succeeded. Nehru's point of view came to be accepted. It was repeated also in Indochina, where also India played a very significant role. You look at the problem that was created by Egypt's decision to take over the Suez Canal, and India actually supported Egypt in this matter. In Hungary, you see that the principle was to some extent compromised. When Soviet Union tried to suppress the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 and allowed the suppression of the revolution with Soviet forces, India did not take a very clear opposition against this, and for which India has been often criticized. By that time, the problems in this ideologically inspired vision of India in the world had already emerged. And the problems that were created by the endemic conflict that had started with Pakistan over Kashmir. We are all familiar with the origin of the Kashmir problem. We know how Nehru became somewhat hastily committed to plebiscite, but then plebiscite was not held. He refused to hold the plebiscite on the ground that Kashmir ultimately acceded to India, and elections in Kashmir, participation of the people of Kashmir in the general elections was a clear indication of how they had accepted this merger with Indian Union. Another problem came from China. Nehru wished to come to an agreement with China, but once China came to occupy Tibet, and following that had differences with India over Tibetan occupation, still Nehru wished to cultivate a close relationship with China by refusing to allow Dalai Lama, the exiled ruler from Tibet, to set up a provisional government. But then the Chinese did not reciprocate. On the contrary, an invasion of China took place in 1962, which devastated Nehru. So the problem in this kind of neutralism certainly existed. Up to a point, neutralism gave Nehru a certain kind of stature. But when neutralism alienated the Americans, for example, a certain dependence on Soviet Union became inevitable, and the Soviet Union actually bailed out India in many difficult situations. The Soviet Union provided India with technology, with resources to set up steel plants. Soviet Union used its power against moves by the Americans to bring the Kashmir plebiscite question into the United Nations. And by then, Pakistan was being looked upon by the Americans as a possible bulwark against the possible Soviet advance in the region. So, given the kind of conflict that was brewing in the subcontinent, the conflict in which India became entangled with China on the one hand, with Pakistan on the other, neutralism in the way Nehru actually wanted to pursue it, by fashioning India as the ideological leader of Asia, didn't succeed in the long run. One had to devise other strategies in order to make non-alignment movement successful. But then when you are actually trying to measure the long-term impact of this neutralism on Indian foreign policy or on world politics, you can see many pitfalls, but you have to look at the moment. 1947 to 1950, the time when India had emerged as a nation, still not so powerful, but at the same time trying to hold out a new ideological vision through which the commitment to progress, to peace, and to emancipation of the oppressed people from Western dominance was stated. That was the great moment for India, for a man like Nehru, to create a new vision. That the vision didn't ultimately succeed is another story.